Good morning and welcome back to my YouTube channel, everybody. Now, as most of my regular viewers will already know, I have recently started producing a line of fast track turnouts to sell on my website, superiormodelrailroads.com. Some of you have already entered the contest as well, but that's not what I'm here to talk about today. For this week's video, I want to share some helpful hints when it comes to building turnouts using the fast tracks jigs. Now, I'm sure some people out there will think that it's probably a bad idea making this video on the grounds that it's going to maybe cut into my customer base, because by the time you've watched it, maybe you'll decide that you'd rather build them yourself. But I'm going to make it anyway, even if it does cost me a few sales. I feel that knowledge is a commodity that needs to be freely shared. So with that in mind, let's just get into the video, and hopefully you'll find something useful. Well, today I had a delivery from Fast Tracks and my jig for number 10 straight HO scale turnouts arrived, along with my first N scale jig. And one of the first things I do is shape the stock rails. You'll probably notice that I blacken the web of the rail with a Sharpie just to tell me exactly where I have to trim. And these filing aids are really useful. The most difficult thing about them is finding a way to hold them. If you watch Fast Track's own videos, they will show Tim or one of his employees holding it in the hand and filing it. And I don't think that's the best way of doing it. I figure there has to be a much better way of holding these jigs. So that's why I came up with this. It's a piece of scrap plywood with some blocks of wood on it. This end, the stock aid fits in here at an angle. And at the other end, any of the frog or point filing tools fits in here. And this strip of wood along the front just locks it against the edge of the table like a bench hook. This end I use all the time. This end I haven't used very much because I found an even better way of doing it. I will get to that later. And I think that's a much easier way of holding it than in the hand. As the rail comes out of the jig, it has a burr on the bottom. And the easiest way to get rid of that is a few strokes with a much finer file. I use the same triangular one that I use for gapping the ties. And there's always a horizontal curve on it like that, which is easy enough to straighten out. But also it always comes out with an upward bow on the rail. I haven't been able to find a way of avoiding that. So it's necessary to correct that with a pair of pliers, just by easing it downwards. With practice you'll figure out exactly how much pressure it needs. And that is almost perfect. And that's just about right. Now this is another tool that Fast Tracks do, which saves a lot of time and effort. It's called the tie breaker, and you just put all the copperhead ties in the holes and trim them all off flush along the top. This is for the number 7 straight turnout, and I goofed up when I bought the number 6 jig. I forgot to buy one of these. So I made my own. This is actually a universal tie breaker jig made out of plywood and styrene strip. And I plotted on my layout design software all the sizes of turnout available and combinations of which length ties I need for them. And I just cut these strips out and tape them onto the front. Originally I was just going to tape the one that I wanted on there, but then when I started building more than one size of turnout in the same sitting, I just put them all there and they hinge at the bottom. I just hold them up into place. I guess a better long-term solution to that would be thin styrene, because they'd be stiffer, but this works fine. And Fast Tracks do different lengths of ties. For the longer ones, just use the turnout ties, but I've found that in the mid-ranges you're better off buying the crossover ties, because that way you can get 2 ties per length. And then I just use an old pair of rail nippers to cut them all off. And then these get reused the next time round. Just clean it up with a large file. And then with any luck, these should fit right in the jig. This is for the throw bar, which I don't need just yet. I've got one missing. So I've got to figure out which one it is and then come back to it. As I say, this is the first time I've done this jig. Now when it comes to gapping the copper ties, there is a potential trap to fall into. Where you've got the 2 pairs close together, here and here, so either end of the frog, there's the outer one of each pair needs an extra gap right in the middle, and that has to be filed before you attach the rails, because you can't reach it afterwards. And it's not quite in the middle of the tie, so I put little dots with the Sharpie both where I need the gap and on the inside end, so I know which way around it goes. That way I'm not going to inadvertently flip it and end up with the gap in the wrong place. All the others, there's no advantage to doing it at this stage, and I find it's a lot easier to use the completed turnout as a handle to hold them while I'm gapping them. There's another potential trap that you can fall into when attaching the stock rails to the ties. The first tie back from the throw bar, the groove is almost double width because it allows for the point rail as well, so it doesn't hold it in the right place. What you have to do is spread the gauge as much as the jig will allow at that point. Otherwise, once the switch rails are in, you'll end up with a narrow gauge. So I hold the side I've already done with my finger and then push the other side out with my small file and then just solder it. And now that is correct. Now here is a time-saving tip that Fast Tracks will tell you not to do. They want you to laboriously file all the point rails with a hand file. I use a bench-mounted belt sander. As I said, they'd recommend you don't do it this way because it will prematurely wear out the tool. But the way I figure it, it's a $60 tool, and by the time it needs replacing, the belt sander will have saved me a lot more than $60 worth of my time. So I think it's a trade-off worth doing. And that is a pair of number 10 frog points filed already. And the other way you save time is that you can fill both sides of the jig at the same time. So you're only tightening and loosening the screws half as often for the same number of turnouts. Now these frog points come out of the jig with a little bit of a burr on the bottom, so it needs to be cleaned up with a small file. I've already done that. And also you might notice that there's a bit of a curve on the end. That needs to be straightened, otherwise the 2 halves of the V will tend to bow away from each other and you end up with a gap. So it's important to straighten them out. If you over straighten them, it's not the end of the world because they will at least press towards each other and each one will be held straight by the other one. What we don't want is a gap between them. Now they come out of the jig with the bottom nice and flat, but everywhere else, all the other 3 sides needing a little bit of clean up with excess solder. you watch the Fast Track instructional videos, they will tell you not to install the V's until after you've got the closure rails in. The trouble with that is that it's then virtually impossible to solder this very important joint correctly. So I do it first. Now, if you've been watching my videos before, you'll know that every jig that I get, I extend on the ends to add additional ties to support the long flexible ends here. Now, if you ask Fast Tracks, they'll say they're not necessary, but there's just too much flexibility here and you're guaranteed to get gauge issues. The first step in extending the jig is to build a pair of turnouts as intended, and then I position them on the quick sticks, but I don't glue them down just yet. What I'm going to do is get it held in the right place, put some weight on it, and the filing tools are perfect for that. Line it up where it needs to go, and then I'm going to use the normal length copper ties designed for plain track because they are thicker. They're in fact the same thickness as the plywood, so it makes it a lot easier to hold it in place while I solder it. And I just eyeball it. It would be much better if Fast Tracks would modify the jigs to include these last ties, or just replace the last wood tie with a copper one. That would also work. And then I make sure I put this in with a gauge. And that will now hold these in gauge nice and straight. So once the other one is done, I can then finish the jig. The procedure to finish the jig extension, once I've got it mounted on plywood with some blocks to stop it sliding, is to just put the turnout back in the jig and then build around these end ties with pieces of thin strip wood. I generally start with the outer ones and then let the glue set so I don't disturb them while I'm doing the others. The tie for the angled track has to be only a partial pocket because, as you can see, they overlap. So the pocket for this tie can't get in the way of that one. So this, anyway, if anyone from Fast Tracks is watching me do all this, I'd like to go on record that I would gladly pay more for jigs that already had the capability to have these end ties positioned properly. Now, either the angled ones or the last full tie across there would also be an acceptable alternative. With the amount of effort that it saves, it would probably be worth an extra $40 a jig, even though I can't imagine that it would cost them more than $5. So as I say, if anyone from Fast Tracks listens to this, I hope they take it to heart. Anyway, now it's just a case of letting that set up, and I'm going to clamp it with one of these other tools. When I started doing these, I was also adding mods at the other end as well to get another tie here, but most of the jigs I've had since the first one, they're too long here. The quick sticks doesn't come all the way to the end, so it makes it completely impossible to add a tie where it needs to go without somehow cutting the end of the jig off. But it seems that it doesn't need it here anyway. It's fairly stiff. This end is really floppy, so it does need it. But at this end, the ends, they stay pretty much in gauge, so I'm not too worried about them. So now, with all the modifications made to both of these jigs, I can get on with fulfilling the orders that I have. So I will just leave you here, and I'll see you again next time. Well, that's all for this week. Hope you enjoyed the video, hope you found something useful, and hope to see you again next week. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.